Welcome to Cyber Politics. Today we're going to be looking into how the so-called tariffs that Trump continues to impose around the world could potentially benefit or harm the economy. So let us get right into it. While some view it as being harmful to the economy and a way to completely destroy jobs along with the GDP of a country, others view it as a way to protect and increase domestic goods and a way to increase exports, which in return would increase internal revenue and would create jobs for the average American. So which one is it? Are tariffs a good way to protect and increase an economy, or a complete route to destroying its own currency with an uncontrollable inflation? Today, we're going to be looking into both aspects of that spectrum and how each side could harm and benefit the country. So let us look into some possible outcomes onto what would be needed to be able to maximize and bring fruition to these tariffs, as well as to what could happen if the tariffs were to fail, how it could shape not only the American economy but also the economy of the world. Before we dive into the future and its possible outcomes, we must first understand the past and the American debt itself, as it is important to understand the dollar and the importance of its value around the world if we wish to understand this ideology of Trump. So let us dive into history and help us understand how the United States managed to not only control the world currency, but how it also managed to control a system that allowed it to indefinitely borrow money with very little consequences for inflation, how it diverted away from the gold system and yet managed to remain as the strongest and most reliable currency around the world. Welcome to the Federal Reserve and its creation in 1913. While the USA had a system purely based on gold standards prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, it made its currency very stable but very inefficient for a new era of world economy. And not only was gold limited but also difficult to move quickly. This meant that the money supply could not expand fast enough to meet the global demands of a growing economy, as well as international trade being limited due to all currencies being tied to gold, restricting credit and investment globally. Not to mention all economic decisions were tied to Gulf movements and not domestic needs, and the country had to adjust to interest rates and taxes to maintain gold reserves even if it hurt its economy. Banks couldn't get emergency cash if they ran out of money, and with no one else to rely on as a last resort for a loan, it allowed the banks to run and collapse rather frequently, bringing us to what many call it as banking panics, happening in 1873, 1893, and 1907. With such a frequent banking panic and with an extreme lack of flexibility in interest rates and no one to rely on as a last resort, the gold system met its end and allowed for the Federal Reserve to be approved and established. This marked the start of a new economical growth, and with it the ability to adjust interest rates at will in accordance to its inflation, as well as the ability to print money at will like there was no tomorrow, which in normal circumstances, this would bring a currency to its knees. However, thanks to the end of World War I, the USA came out as a superpower in the world, and many countries around the world began to see the US dollar not only as an extremely stable and safe currency, but also as a new form of currency to import and export goods with ease. This alongside with a growing economy like the world had never seen, and with the previous world currency, the pound sterling from the United Kingdom being left bankrupt after World War I, and gold being too limited and heavy to transport rapidly, and with growing economies around the world, countries needed a new payment method to rely on, and thus the start and rise of the US dollar as a new world currency has started. This action was later reinforced by a deal between the US and Saudi Arabia, which came to be known as the petrodollar, a system that enforced the entire world to be able to only trade oil for dollars from the largest oil exporter around the world. And now, with the higher demand in dollars around the world, countries were forced to have more and more dollars in order to continue to import oil and continue to grow its industrial capabilities and GDP. With such enforcement, the US was able to finally secure its biggest ace, and the ability to print money to unimaginable quantities without the risk of inflation, or better said, with very little risk of inflation, as inflation rather than staying nationally, it was now being distributed around the world, for more and more dollars began to start circulating internationally rather than nationally. In fact, as we speak, about 60 to 70% of all physical US dollars circulate around the world, but like every great empire, everything comes to an end sooner or later, and the petrodollar is quickly losing its influence around the world. Now as we speak, not only has Saudi Arabia decided to not renew its 80-year petrodollar agreement, which had expired in 2024, but it has now decided to trade its oil with other currencies around the world, mainly with the Chinese yuan. This is and will continue to be a huge loss for America, as not only does it threaten its currency as a world currency, but it opens the doors for a new economy to rival America, and with that, an even greater problem. For if the world were to decide that it no longer needs US dollars to be able to trade goods internationally as a global currency, such dollars will slowly begin to make its way back to America, and that will bring an inflation to the United States like the country has never seen. Not to mention all the repercussions it would also have around the world, and all the harm it could bring mainly to developing countries with a large dependency in US dollars. The effect would be global, and the world might take decades to recover from such a devastating impact. Now, as real as the threat may be, it is still something that would require a lot of difficulties and drastic changes in America and the world for the dollar to ever lose its power as a world currency. And even though some investors might be losing interest in the American economy, it is extremely difficult for that to happen anytime soon. No matter how hard the world may try, the power that America has over the world is too great and too deep for everyone to escape. In other words, the dollar is here to stay for a long time to come. But why is this important to understand? And why does the economy now face a slow but steady and worrisome decline? Well, like any other country that continues to print money massively, sooner or later that inflation will be unavoidable. For not only has the US been printing money to supply the demand of other countries, but it has also continued to print it in massive quantities to keep its economy afloat and all of its social programs. Now, as we all know, a big hit and decline did not just happen for America during the pandemic, but also for the world. An unexpected virus that threatened the world brought an entire global economy to a halt. This setback created a recession around the world that many countries still continue and try to fully recover from, including the US. As a matter of fact, during the span of just 3 years, the US printed enough money to increase its national debt by 20%. This alongside with the world taking years to try to recover from the pandemic, and many still struggling to fully recover, wars, and even other countries trying to diversify its economy outside of the US, and of course the petrodollar now being renewed. Now what America once seemed as untouchable, for the first time in many years has the economy and the power of America begun to weaken. And every year with less power and influence around the world, the US has not done much to try to fix its inflation. Aside from increasing its interest rates, it has not yet created a solid plan to try to stabilize its economy. We now know its national debt is around $37 trillion. Yet, it continues to retain all of its social programs and continues to support wars that no longer possess a real threat to America. It just continues to print and print more money every year. That, alongside with a deficit of around $2 trillion every year and increasing, has now made the American economy finally come to a point where finally the average American is starting to not only notice a decline in wealth, but has also begun to experience it as well. Now more and more Americans see themselves having to work 2 jobs in order to be able to maintain a decent lifestyle. It is easy to see how the average American now sees itself struggling month to month, and how the American dream seems to get further and further away every year. However, not everything is lost, and a possible solution for the American economy to flourish again would be by bringing the federal debt down and getting rid of the yearly deficit. Perhaps first by starting to completely reduce the federal spending by $2 trillion or more. This would allow for inflation to completely come to a stop. With it, interest rates would fall and inflation would slowly but surely begin to go down. But that's easier said than done, and in order to do so, many reforms and bills would have to be passed. Now the deficit every year is that of about $2 trillion, but that would only allow for inflation to stop, and it would not give the US any extra money to repay its debt. So a far more drastic strategy would have to be reached in order to be able to not only meet the spending quota every year, but also somehow manage to save money and repay its debt. So let us look into some possible ideas. First, all social programs would have to be reduced, and many small programs would have to be eliminated completely. That would include healthcare, government assistance, money to infrastructures, money to college students and schools, and yes, even cutting military spending. A massive deduction in all federal spending would have to be reduced in order to meet a quota to save more than $2 trillion every year. Thousands of jobs would be lost, and such a drastic event could potentially even bring a recession to the country, leaving the remaining working people to carry out for the economy. Many people would have to rely on food stamps, weak programs and unemployment, but that would only continue to increase the federal spending. It would not allow for the government to be able to get rid of its deficit. Therefore, food stamps, weak and unemployment would also have to be cut dramatically. This would push families to go live with relatives. More jobs could also be lost in the process due to people stopping from going out to eat or buying things they no longer need. And a recession that could take place for years to come would also arise. However, at the same time, inflation would stop, and prices would sooner or later come to a stop as interest rates would come to a halt. Without a deficit, inflation would no longer continue to grow, and with the small extra savings, the government would finally begin to repay its national debt. Interest rates would remain the same. Slowly but surely people would begin to continue to save, continue to buy more goods, and the country's economy would begin to slowly boost itself. In return, new jobs and even small businesses would arise. However, this would be a slow and painful way and could take years or even decades, and a lot of pain economically from the average American citizen, as many other factors would also come into play. But it could also be the best way and perhaps the most secure way of achieving a solid recovery, as the economy would build itself from the ground up. So even though this way could potentially be one of the very few possible ways for any other country to fix its inflation, for America, on the other hand, there could potentially be a far quicker way, and yes, that would include tariffs. The ideology of Trump could perhaps be a solution, although riskier and more extreme, but with a quick fix, that instead of the US having to go decades of instability, it could go only a few years of economical pain, and finally we dive into the tariff world. Yes, tariffs could not only fix the deficit, but if done correctly, it could pay the entire federal debt of $37 trillion faster than any other proposal. And here is where the ideology of Trump kicks in. A very risky move indeed, for not only would America make the entire world be against it, and could harm trade with almost the rest of the world for decades to come, as well as harming hundreds of jobs in the process and a spike in price with almost every single good, forcing Americans to have to work longer hours in order to maintain a similar lifestyle or even to stay afloat. However, if done correctly, in the next 3 to 5 years inflation would not only be stopped, but also it would begin to reverse and the purchasing power of America would increase, as the debt continued to be repaid, allowing for interest rates to drop and allowing Americans to begin to loan money from banks. With cheaper interest rates and an inflation coming to a halt, soon the average American would start to purchase cars and houses once again. New businesses and jobs would arise as the market continues to grow, stabilizing the economy and bringing a stronger purchasing power to every American over time. But in order for it to work, it would have to be done in a very careful manner, not simply by imposing tariffs at extreme levels to other countries simply because it can. For extreme percentages of tariffs to other countries would not only bring retaliations from the rest of the world, but it would abolish jobs faster and would push Americans for a recession much faster, and perhaps with a longer and more painful recovery for the country. So what would be a better way and more strategical way of making the tariffs work? To start, tariffs would have to be imposed to nearly every single country and good rather alike. Perhaps a 20% on every single good imported to America could do the trick. Yes, it would still be high and very risky, and would still cause for many jobs to be lost. But rather than completely pushing companies to completely collapsing immediately due to extreme tariffs and for major retaliation from other countries, a smaller tariff rate would allow for many other businesses to still remain in business. Yes, the economy would still go down, jobs would still be lost, and a possible recession could still happen. But the likelihood would be much lower and slower, allowing for the country and its citizens to have more time to adapt or find new economical ways, without the risk of families losing everything from one day to another. Soon billions of dollars and perhaps even trillions of dollars could begin to be accumulated by the USA every year, and with it, not only would it allow for some federal programs to remain without having to be cut off, the debt would finally begin to be repaid. So yes, in theory, the tariffs could work. But here is where the problem begins. As it is not simply risky, and many other factors would arise, especially from the reaction of other countries, but mainly for the internal corruption of the US government. As in order for this to work, the current administration would have to be 100% willing to using all the money earned on tariffs to focusing on paying the deficit and debt. And that is something that would be very, very unlikely to happen. For once the money begins to enter the country and billions or even trillions start to be collected, it would be very easy for the administration to feel as it could use some or even most of the money for other means, such as trying to increase its military spending by trillions and even trying to fund more projects and infrastructures, leaving the debt to once again not being paid or only being paid in small quantities, and this would not fix anything. It would only put the economy at risk and would only put a bandage over a cut, rather than taking the proper means to fully curing the problem from the main source. Not to mention that once a new administration were to come in, it could easily undo all of the hard work, leaving this ideology and efforts to become pointless and bringing no positive outcome in the end. Yes, the tariff idea might not be completely bad, as America stands in a unique place in the world as it controls the world economy, but corruption and an administration that would feel extremely tempted to use the tariff money for other needs might make this idea completely obsolete. With the right intentions, however, in a single decade it could pay its debt, and in half, it could make America great again by not only stopping inflation but also by deflating it, assuming that the next 2-3 administrations were to continue with the same ideology, which would also be extremely unlikely, although in paper it might seem like a great idea. In practice, it is something that would be extremely hard to do and very unlikely. Corruption, temptation from this administration, pushback from its citizens, and a new administration that would make this idea worthless. The problem here is not if tariffs could fix the economy, but rather if the government could put its ambitions and corruption aside to allow it to flourish. And with all that said, what are your thoughts? Are you against tariffs? Or do you believe that Trump and his party has what it takes to make the best of these tariffs? Which plan do you think would be more effective, and do you think Americans are ready to truly be willing to struggle and put in the hard work for a better good? Or do you believe the struggle would be in vain? Now, the purpose of this video was not to encourage anyone to be in favor of any political ideology expressed, but simply to showcase possible outcomes and to offer what view there to talk about. A view of the other side of the coin. This has been my first YouTube video ever recorded and edited. I am soloing this new adventure, so if you like the content, please like and subscribe, as it would greatly help me. I will do my best to continue to make political and economical videos on any international and national topic. This has been Cyber Politics, and you will see me soon again.